choppers would come in, and you would be doing something, walking through the halls, heading to a lab, working in one of the units, and someone would come in the loudspeaker and say, "Incoming, 15 minutes." And that would set into action. Someone from the laboratory immediately grabbing a tray with test tubes, needles, alcohol wipes, and a rubber tube actually, to tie around a person's arm, and head down to the chopper pads. Then the choppers would begin landing, and we would move the patients out into a little room where we would begin the triage procedure. That involved, the doctors taking a look and me drawing blood and beginning to prepare for their introduction into the hospital. It was an interesting process because you had to spend quite a bit of time under the choppers while they were still running, and sometimes things didn't go as expected. Although people were very stabilized, sometimes things could go wrong. One time there was a gentleman who had a pretty much full-length bandage, and when we got him open, the doctor looked at it and immediately started cutting it up. And I swear there was a stream of blood that hit the roof of the chopper. We immediately clamped it, and I just ran as fast as I could back to the laboratory, got as many positive, negative, I didn't care, blood units as I could find, and ran as quick as I could and got back, and we put him on him. The gentleman survived and went home. But so things like that were known to happen. We did the best we could do. One time I ran into a gentleman my age over at a coffee shop, and he had on a t-shirt that said Vietnam. And I said, "Hey, are you Vietnam?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "When?" And he told me the years. I said, "Yeah, I was there too." And, "What were you?" He said, "I was a medic." I said, "Oh, okay. Yeah, you guys are heroes." And he said, "I don't know." So he sat down and he talked to me, and it was real clear he was struggling. Life was not being easy. He was having physical problems that he wasn't dealing with. Problems with family and so on and so forth. And I said, "Tell me some stories." And he did. And I'm not going to repeat them, because many of them involved people stepping on bombs that were meant to destroy tanks rather than individuals, and what happens when things don't go right in the jungle. But I explained to him, if you share these stories, these memories, that you don't relive them, because people who have PTSD tend to actually be reliving those memories, not just remembering them. I said, but when you share them, they just become stories then. We all have stories. Some stories are nice, some stories are ugly, but they're just stories. And I have no idea what happened to him. I know when I walked away, the last thing he said to me, "Larry, there just was so much blood." And I said, "Yes, I know." Which reminded me of sitting on the helicopters looking over at another trooper over there holding onto a hose with a compressor, and realizing that his job was to clean the blood out of the chopper if necessary. So, it was the guys who did that work, and the gentlemen who we work with are all heroes, and every single one of them. But the people in the medical corps, including the chopper pilots and the medics and the field, are perhaps even more heroic. I don't know. Chopper pilots went in to LZs that were hot again and again and again, frequently against the order of their superiors. Medics, actually, many of them would take their rather meager wages and have their families send back medical supplies because they wanted to be able to have more that they could do for these men and women when they were injured. It was quite amazing and quite interesting and quite exhilarating to see these people and to know them.
Today is Friday, July 25th, 2025. My name is Becky Parr, and I have the privilege of interviewing Larry Sturgeon, who volunteers for me. I am a hospice volunteer coordinator and in charge of the We Honor Veterans program with True Community Care. And Larry is my MVP. He is one of my best volunteers and has shown up in many veterans' lives, hearing their stories. So today we have the honor of getting to hear his story.
Right. Good. Well, good to be here, Becky, and it's good to have you, my coordinator and person who in recent years has given me direction. I'm looking forward to telling this story for my fellow veterans to consider, and for my family and friends, of course. So I know that you know me well enough to guide me down the path that would be best. So I'm in your hands.
Well, let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Yes, I was born in a little town in central Oklahoma called El Reno. It was right on the border of where the Cherokee Strip used to be, the land that once belonged to the Cherokee Nation. It was a small town, but it had a surprisingly good educational system. There was a federal prison there, the Rock Island Railroad, the railroad for which my father worked, was stationed there. And, the wind blows a lot in Oklahoma, and it's hot, but the people there at that time were kind and generous, and it was a pleasure to live there. I was kind of a sickly child. I had rheumatic fever as a child, age 4. So I was isolated in the early years of my life from other people and children because I couldn't get another strep infection, or would have perhaps damaged my heart. So for the early years, I spent a lot of time at home. When I went to school, I wasn't allowed to play at recess with the other kids. Because I couldn't be that active. So I would sit over under a tree and dig holes and put twigs over them, and they were either underground parking garages or traps, And after a few years, I had the entire perimeter of the playground surrounded, so we were safe. Eventually, I got to become more active. I still remember the first time I walked to school on my own, although it was only a few blocks. As soon as I got around the corner from my house, I started running, something I wasn't allowed to do. But sometimes we have to make our own decisions, even at the age of 8. So I did. I became more and more active as I got well. There was always a time we were taking penicillin prophylactically until I was 18. But I began to develop and became quite athletic. I was, football player, basketball player, track, and tennis, the sport that later became my favorite sport. I feel like I got a good education. In the course of 3 years, I completed all the high school credits, except for the 4th year of English, which had to be done. And then I began taking college classes at the junior college in the town where I grew up. I think I felt like I walked away with a good education, and certainly physically I was well. I was planning on going to medical school. It was a situation where, assuming that I could do the prerequisites and get a good score on the MCAT test, there was a chair waiting for me at the University of Oklahoma Medical School. The doctors who had been with me all through all those years felt I was just perfect for medicine. I was kind of just following that path. I hadn't really thought about it much. But then I went to school and began to take some liberal arts classes, some philosophy classes. I began to realize that a lot of the things that had been a part of my life, some of the religious aspects that my mother was very, very much into, didn't really fit with my understanding of what I wanted my life to be. So, I remember talking to a professor. His name was Dr. Sill, S-I-L-L, and telling him about some of the things that I felt to be true, and might not have been as acceptable to my parents. And he said, you can believe anything you care to believe as long as you can tell me why. And so that's kind of been my guiding idea about philosophies and beliefs. I need to understand why I believe something. I need to know why I'm being motivated by something. And I need to, once I make those decisions, then to follow that on through to the best of my ability. At one point, as I was getting near graduation time, it occurred to me that we were in a conflict in Vietnam, in which we seemed to be drafting people from the lowest economic stratus of our society and people of color. And so I began to investigate what was going on over there, and I decided that I could postpone any further graduate education, med school, for instance. And I decided I was going to object conscientiously to the war. And I began to talk to people on the draft board in El Reno. And they explained to me that they didn't think that was a good idea because if I did that, then I would certainly be a field medic. And they'd already lost several young men and didn't care to lose any more. They told me that they actually knew that there was a recruiter, an Army recruiter in Oklahoma City, And they were looking for someone just like me because they needed someone who was a chemist, as I was.
So you graduated with
Yeah.
a degree in chemistry?
Right, because I graduated with a degree in chemistry. And should I care to join up, I would be trained as a medic, first of all, and then as a medical technician, a laboratory technician. And they had a position waiting for me in a hospital in Japan. And so I did. I joined up. And a few weeks later, I jumped on an airplane in Little Rock, Arkansas, and flew for the first time in my life. You know.
Can I get some clarification real quick?
Of course.
Because I feel like there's that's a big turn. So you
Okay.
graduated college with the intent of being a conscientious objector,
Mm-hmm.
and then ended up meeting with the draft board, or you thought your draft number was going to come up?
Well,
or
yeah.
how did you go from there to meeting with the recruiter?
Right, good question. Yeah, I had a very, very short number. I was 2S, obviously. As soon as you graduated, you went from 2S to 1A.
Whether you graduated high school or college,
if you were not, if you reached that age, you were 1A. And if you were assuming you were physically capable, you were potentially drafted. They had a couple of various ways of determining who would be drafted over the course of years, but the last one was a lottery in which they took all of the potential birth dates and, randomly put them in order. And when your day came up, then you would go. And if you were a 2S, and as soon as you weren't, you were at the top of the list, pretty much. So the potential for drafting was quite high. And I did talk with people who were involved in the draft board because they were the ones who I would need to talk to if I wanted to object conscientiously. I would become a conscientious objector. And they were the ones who put me in touch with the Army recruiter who was aware of this position. And it seemed like a good fit. So I went from being a student to being, a recruit. And I joined the Army, which meant I was giving them a 3-year commitment.
What year was that when you joined the Army?
1968, or January of 1968, I joined the Army. So I was looking at on through, then my life was taken care of January until January of 1971.
So you graduated in May and ended up joining the Army in January.
Yes.
The following January.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And so I got on an airplane, first trip I've ever flown, first time I'd ever flown, and we took off and landed in El Paso, Texas. And I was greeted and took out to a olive gray bus and driven to Fort Bliss, Texas. Fort Bliss is very near the border. The weather is rather inclement, but they took away everything I had and gave me an entire different set of gear to wear and use. Uniform, shoes, a footlocker, all the things that you'd need to do training, boots.
Can you recall, Larry, what that felt like to get on a plane for your first time and to know that I was going to object to being in the military, but now I've chosen to join?
I can tell you about it. No, it was fun getting in the airplane. I was actually kind of fascinated by the patchwork of fields and rivers and streams down below, as we flew over. And, I found it was a little bumpy, but I didn't mind that. Ever since then, I've loved to fly. I've loved to, because if you're in an airplane, then you're going someplace else. So, I've always looked forward to flying, and I've flown all over the world, really. But at that time, it just was fascinating, something I'd never done before. And I was excited about it. The idea of going to Japan really seemed like a good one. What had happened is I didn't realize that I had made an actual move out of the path that had been set down for me into a path that I was creating myself, and so I was excited about it. I didn't know what it would be like, obviously, never having been to the Orient, to Asia, but I was looking forward to it. I certainly had no idea about what was waiting for me at basic training. So we got there, all of my hair was shaved off, new clothes were given me, and we were taking over to a barracks and introduced to a very loud-spoken drill sergeant, who was happy to greet us there and tell us what our schedules were now going to be. We'd be awakening at 5 in the morning to reveille, cleaning up our areas, making our beds so that you could bounce a quarter on them, and falling in outside of the barracks, doing our daily dozen calisthenics, and then marching over to the mess hall and walking on a rather long series of monkey bars until we could get off and actually go into the mess hall. And that would be the beginning of our day every day. Days were filled with the typical stuff that my fellow Army veterans will tell you about basic training. We marched a lot, we trotted a lot, we climbed over walls, we crawled under live ammunition, we learned how to put on a gas mask and had the opportunity to take it off in a tent full of tear gas. We didn't get to do much of anything else than that. Our whole focus became that particular part of our lives. The Army is very good at beginning to remake you to some degree. We learned a lot of stuff. We were told over and over again, we were in formation, that person in front of you and behind you and to your left and to your right is the person who may save your life someday. It won't be me, it won't be General Westmoreland, it'll be one of these people. We learned over and over and over again, if you're given an order, you have to act on that order immediately. It is not your job to consider it, it's your job to act. That may save your life one day as well, and we learned discipline. It was not an easy thing to do at all. A lot of people had real problems, real issues with the physical part of it, particularly. It was incredibly cold some mornings, and unseasonably hot some days. So, we certainly began to get fit. One morning when we woke up, the first thing we would normally do would be to go to the latrine. And so we woke up and began to get ready. We walked in, and one of us had decided it was just too hard. And he had taken his life by hanging himself by his belt from the pipe. And it was too difficult, which is really, really unfortunate. But it did kind of bring home the fact that we are about to do something that is going to be very dangerous. And there is a reason why you should be concerned about your life, and there's a reason why we should be doing the things that we're doing. So, we continued on through, and we managed to get to the first time that we were able to go away from the base and go out into El Paso and have a weekend and, drink a few beers and get a little bit of camaraderie going on again, and we did. And then we came back and we finished our training. My next posting was in San Antonio, Texas, Fort Sam Houston. It's where most of the medical training takes place. I went through a course of learning how to be a medic, the things that you have to do if you're in the field. First thing you need to do is do a little bit of assessment. How am I going to get these people back to the LZ, the landing zone? This guy can walk there by himself. This guy's going to need somebody helping him. We're going to have to get some way to carry this guy in. And then we began to learn how to what to do in certain situations. What is the very, very first aid that you do? What are the things you can do to turn this situation, which is a very good one, to one which is manageable? A lot of that involved, of course, crowd control drugs, as we used to call them, primarily ketamine. And, so I went through that course. I had worked as an orderly when I was in college, so I was very comfortable doing the things we needed to do. And I think I did quite well of it. And then shortly thereafter, I moved over to a whole other campus and began learning how to be a laboratory technician and everything that included. The chemistry part I knew quite well, but things like complete blood counts, blood types, blood matching, parasitology, bacteriology, all the other disciplines were brand new to me. I found it fascinating. And then there were little kind of moments that I'll never forget. The first time we had to learn how to actually draw blood from somebody else, it's quite a moment. And actually, the first time somebody else who had never done that before drew blood from us was probably.
So you practiced on each other?
Yes, probably just as much of a moment. So we did that. We worked through that entire program. It was intriguing and interesting. And then I went home for really the first leave that I had, and I felt different when I was back in El Reno. I had changed. There was any doubt in my mind I had changed. There was a little bit more seriousness in my demeanor, I think. And but I stayed there and I saw everybody did the things one would do. Back then, in the late 60s, it was still half the 60s and half the 70s, frankly, So we, and a little bit of the 50s thrown in too. We went and did the usual stuff like driving our cars down the drag and stopping in the local drive-through to get a barbecue burger and a Dr. Pepper, and seeing all of our friends one last time. Then I reported once again to this side, the Oklahoma City airport, and we flew to Seattle, and from Seattle we were processed again and flew to Honolulu. From Honolulu we flew to Tokyo. As soon as I stepped off the plane in Tokyo, I knew I was someplace quite different. The entire environment, the smells, the touches, the sounds, the things that I was seeing were different than anything I'd ever seen before. And we had an escort meet us there, and we had the first time I was on a train in Japan, which is an interesting experience if you've never done so. Quite crowded. I was the tallest person in the area, so I could see over everybody. And I took a relatively short trip from Tokyo to a place called Tsugami Ono. Tsugami Ono is kind of midway between Tokyo here and Yokohama here. And it is where Camp Zama Hospital existed. It was a walled compound. You walked in, there was a rather large administrative building directly in front of you when we walked in, guard houses, of course, on either side. And I walked in and reported to the commanding officer, Private Larry Sturgeon, serial number 15, yada, 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 reporting for duty, sir, as ordered. And
that was Camp
Zama.
Camp Zama, and you were part of the 406?
I was part of the 406 Medical Laboratory. I didn't really know that at the time. The 406 Medical Laboratory had a long history in the Army. It was the first portable laboratory in Southeast Asia, and their mission in the beginning began working with MASH units. Then later they were moved to Japan, where they did Camp Zama Hospital. And they had another facility where they did actual research, which turned out to be quite good, particularly in the area of burn treatments and the medications that we were going to use to help that process and that recovery. I was introduced then to my commanding officer, Captain Camp, and he asked me my name, and of course he said, "Okay, Sturgeon, well, we're going to call you Fish." I said, "Okay," because everybody had to have a nickname. So I said, "Fish," and he called it another one. "This is Jonesy. Jonesy, next time we get in choppers, take Fish with you and show him around." The way the situation worked in that hospital was this. We had discovered, the Army Medical Corps discovered that we had what was called a golden hour, in which we could get people out of the field and to someplace where we could stabilize them and then get them as quickly as possible to a unit such as ours in Camp Zama Hospital. A lot of them survived, many more than survived in previous wars. So our situation at the hospital basically was this. We were prepared to deal with any kind of wound and just about any kind of medical condition, and we did so. Our patients, the soldiers, were stabilized in Vietnam and then sent to either Yokosuka Air Force Base in Tokyo or Takahashi Airport, and I think it's Takahashi Airport as well. Then they were choppered over to us. So we had a couple of chopper pads that were near the burn unit and the surgical unit.
Could you describe a typical day?
Sure.
When you were working at Camp Zama?
Camp Zama.
Zama.
Yeah, that's okay. Tachikawa Air Force Base, thank you. Well, yeah, it would depend on what you were doing. Obviously, we had to work. You would be working in one of the various locations. You might be the person who was sitting up front drawing blood, the phlebotomist, if you will. You might be working in the basic CBC area. Those are the places where they did the tests, which told the doctors if you had an infection or if you had a number of various types of conditions. It's probably the most basic blood test still to this day done. You would do blood counts, see how many red blood cells there were, how many platelets. You'd make a slide, and then look at it under a microscope and describe the nature of the cells that you saw there, and then make that report. Right across the hall from that was the blood chemistry lab, which is where I worked most of the time. And at that time, we were really we had one of the earliest autoanalyzers available. And it worked beautifully most of the time. It was a colorimetric process, but it also failed frequently. The gentleman I worked with frequently with Takahashi-san, who was a Japanese national and had been working there for years, incredibly competent, knew exactly what to do, and he taught me how to deal with that aspect of it. The other aspect that I needed to deal with was when it was broken down, we still had to perform the tests. So we went back to the old test tube method of doing it, that one of which I understood very well. So we did that. We also had a laboratory which dealt with bacteriology, people who had various diseases that were primarily bacterial in nature, and then parasitology. We saw things over there that a hospital lab in the United States would never see, various and sundry parasites, including malaria. We had a very, very good drug for preventing malaria in Vietnam at that time, but most people didn't care to take it because it apparently caused diarrhea, and if you were living in a hooch out in the jungle with nothing but a trench latrine, that was not a place you cared to visit many times a day. So we had a higher than expected level of malaria in our patients, but we had the ability to treat them as well, so that worked out. And then perhaps the most important area was our blood bank, where we cross-matched blood and kept them fresh and ready for use. I remember one time, during the day, I should tell you, choppers would come in and you would be doing something, walking through the halls, heading to a lab, working in one of the units, and someone would come in the loudspeaker and say, "Incoming, 15 minutes." And that would set into action. Someone from the laboratory immediately grabbing a tray with test tubes, needles, alcohol wipes, and a rubber tube actually, to tie around a person's arm and head down to the chopper pads. Then the choppers would begin landing, and we would move the patients out into a little room where we would begin the triage procedure. That involved, the doctors taking a look and me drawing blood and beginning to prepare for their introduction into the hospital. It was an interesting process because you had to spend quite a bit of time under the choppers while they were still running, and sometimes things didn't go as expected. Although people were very stabilized, sometimes things could go wrong. One time there was a gentleman who had a pretty much full-length bandage, and when we got him open, the doctor looked at it and immediately started cutting it up, and I swear there was a stream of blood that hit the roof of the chopper. We immediately clamped it, and I just ran as fast as I could back to the laboratory, got as many positive, negative, I didn't care, blood units as I could find, and ran as quick as I could and got back, and we put him on him. The gentleman survived and went home. But so things like that were known to happen. We did the best we could do, and the best we could do turned out to be pretty good. About 98% of the people who made a test made it either home or back to Vietnam.
Tell me a little bit about what you shared before when you said they either made it home or back to Vietnam, and at some point there was a shift on where people really wanted to go.
Yeah, well, the way it was set up, we had very clear instructions. Some people might leave, almost immediately to go to hospitals in the United States if they were really stabilized, and the stuff they needed, stuff they needed would be more easily available there. But most of them stayed until they got to a point where they were either going to go home or going to go back to Nam. They were either going back to the world or they were going to go back to Vietnam. And that where they went was dependent upon how much time was left in their tour of duty in Nam. If they had, I don't remember the exact number of days, but if they had over a given number of days, or months or weeks, then they would be shipped from us back to the unit in Vietnam. If it was less than that, they would then be sent back to the world. And of course, it was unspoken, but many of us felt that, it would be nice if they could all go home, wouldn't it? So in some certain cases, it was acceptable to say, gosh, Rodriguez may need to stay here another week. Yeah, he looks a little peaked, doesn't he? I think maybe we'll keep him here another week. And changes like that made a difference to the outcome of these boys' service. So that did happen. And but primarily we just took care of them. Right there, we had the Far East Burn Unit, and this was a time when we were really trying to understand how to treat burns, particularly burns like which occurred from napalm. If you get hit with napalm, it will stay on your body until it reaches the bone, and will burn and just burn. It causes horrendous burns, and it requires a whole new set of skin. So how do we do that? Well, they were developing artificial skin that could be used to cover up the areas that had the burn until the real skin could begin to grow back. It was an incredibly painful procedure, and didn't always work. And many times our patients would get horrendous infections and go from recovering to dying. Back then, we didn't have a pulsometer, which is the little device that's put on your finger when you go to the doctor and tells them what your oxygen content is. That was something the doctors really needed to know. And the only way we could make that happen was by drawing blood from an artery rather than a vein. And the only two arteries that you could really access would be your carotid artery right here, or your femoral artery on the inside of your thigh. So we learned how to do that quite well. We had long shifts. Usually you'd work 5 days a week, 7 to 5. But we didn't have enough people to cover all the evening sessions. So periodically your turn would come up, and you would come in at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, work till 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, work till 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, and 8 o'clock till Monday morning. And during those late night hours, usually nothing much happened. But anyone who works in a hospital will tell you there are times when those hours are the busiest of the day. And that certainly was true in our case. So things might get so busy that you have no choice but to call up to the barracks and get another tech to come over. So we would do that, and the two of us would work crazily for a period of time, pumping adrenaline up in ourselves, obviously. And then we would spend a couple of hours kind of coming down from that particular high. And again, we did the best we could.
Do you have a patient experience or a certain experience that stands out from people that you might have helped with triaging or moments serving in the hospital?
I remember, well, one of the earliest things that I remember was, I got in there, and one of the things we had to do, of course, was go around to the wards and draw morning blood. The doctors would order certain blood tests, and we would take them. And one of the first days I was there, I went down, and there was a gentleman there. He had an Hispanic name, and he was a double amputee. And just trying to keep conversation, I asked him, "So how are you?" And he told me, "I can't go home this way." And I said, "Well, I hear you. You're going to be sent to Walter Reed Hospital, and what they can do with prosthetics these days is absolutely amazing." And the next day I came and saw him. I said, "So how you doing?" And he said, "I can't go home this way." And so the third day, when I came back, I noticed there wasn't an order for blood work. And I said, "Where is Rodriguez?" let's say. And the nurse said, "Didn't he tell you? He couldn't go home that way." So he had just simply slipped away during the night. And, those things happen. Sometimes it was just too much. I remember, we were doing triage, and I actually ended up reading about this incident in an article or a book someplace, but I was there doing my work when it occurred. The person who ran the laboratory was actually the head nurse, but in this case, the head of surgery was down in triage with us. And he was with a younger man. He had captain's badge on his shoulders, and he was wearing a Class A uniform as opposed to scrubs. And the head of surgery was showing around, and he said, "Listen, this gentleman over here, we need to open him up and make certain everything's cleaned out in there. He had a gut wound, something that can become very messy very quickly. You'll take him." The younger captain turned and looked at the colonel and said, "But sir, I'm a pediatrician." And the colonel looked at it and he said, "That's why I gave you the simple ones." And that's kind of what we had to do. We did the best we could, and we did it very well. We used to see, I used to go from time to time to the neuropsych ward, and that was one of the saddest places I've ever been in my life. Those were primarily people who had combat-related injuries. They were the people who later on were going to have a high potential for PTSD. As many of you know, we weren't exactly welcomed back happily into this country when we came home. People confused the soldiers with the war. And so a lot of people came home. They had been given drugs while they were with us, and they no longer had them. They just kind of drifted away. We have lost more men to suicide and drug overdoses than we did during the war. Mm-hmm. And so these gentlemen would just be sitting there waiting for the drugs to take effect, and eventually they were going to be going back to Nam. That was very sad. Other than that, I mean, there were a lot of serious things that went on, but there also were a lot of kind of very collegial things that we did and fun we had. I mean, the nurses and the techs and the medics from time to time would just hop on a train and head down to Tokyo, to Shinjuku or the Ginza, and eat sushi and drink and just blow off steam, as it were. There is a story that's told, and I'm not going to go into the details because it's not about me, but it at the end of it, MPs are walking away from a group of medical corps people saying, "Darn medics, gotta hate them, gotta love them," And that was kind of the case. We didn't have quite the same discipline that much of the rest of the Army worked under. We were a little bit looser and a little bit more able to interact with each other as well. So we did that. Or we would go to, the Izu Peninsula, which was near Yokohama, and it was a beach. It was a rock beach, but it was a beach not too far from the Daibatsu, which is one of the biggest statues of the Buddha, a beautiful temple, and we would go there. We spent a lot of time eating.
You're a foodie. So
yeah, I know. I became partially a foodie from there. When I first ate sushi the first time, I said, "This is not food, this is bait." But I changed my mind when I actually ate some good food sushi. Takahashi one time took me home to visit his family, and then he took me out the next morning. I spent the night with him into his little boat that he kept in Tokyo Harbor. And that was his hobby. And so we sailed around Tokyo Harbor and caught a couple of fish. I got the worst sunburn I've ever had in my entire life. I'm not exactly a person who turns tan, but it was still fun. We still had a good time.
Who were some of your closest friends from that time? It sounds like this doctor that is a Japanese national.
Yeah, well, he was another chemist. Yes, he was certainly. And the gentleman who did most of our night shifts was a fun guy to be around as well. I was involved with the librarian and with all the people who worked in the laboratory, a couple of the nurses, everybody knew this was a temporary thing. So everything we did with a lot of passion. I still remember going to one of the nurses' houses to watch the moon landing, and that was a really fun time. But we finished, we got done, and it was time to go home. And I was there my entire tour of duty.
Which was how long?
Well, 3 years total, and I was there for 2.5 years myself. At the time, I was just before I was ready to go. I was about to be sent home. I went before a promotion board. I was an E4, and I was perhaps going to be promoted to an E5. After the officers had asked me the question they wanted to ask me, they said, Special Sturgeon, have you ever considered re-enlisting? It's not a bad life, And I thought about it. My experience there had been painful and wonderful, and one that I'll never forget, and certainly one that molded who I am. It was the first time I really began to understand that I need to be able to do something that has some element of service in it. And I thought about it. I thought, well, I could go to Germany. But what I told them was, we have a problem here with the support we're getting from our country. And I don't know that I feel comfortable re-enlisting in the Army at this time. And so I didn't. So a few weeks later, I was given an airplane ticket and my final check. And I had a Class A uniform on. I had my duffel bag over my shoulder. And I got on a plane and flew back to San Francisco this time. Now, I didn't have anybody throwing plastic bags full of feces at me. But when I walked down the hallways of that airport, people averted their eyes. And when I came into a waiting area, no one would sit down next to me. So, we heard of what was going on. I went home. I took everything that I had with the exception of a reel-to-reel recorder and a very nice camera that I bought in Japan and threw them in the trash, including my Class A uniforms, including all the pictures I had, and just began to live my new life. I was done with that. At the time, my father was ill. He had emphysema. I got to spend some time with him, and he was a changed man. My father was half Cherokee Indian. He was a railroad. He was involved in the railroad. He became a conductor on the passenger trains for the Rock Island Railroad. Then he became a union official. He was the general chairman of the Order of Railroad Conductors and Brakemen. He traveled a lot, particularly Chicago. But anytime he could be home, if I was doing anything, he would be a part of it. He called me Pal. That was his little nickname for me. And I didn't give him near as much time as I should have given him. Children tend to do that. But I got to spend some time with him then. And he told me a few things. He told me, son, whatever you do, don't wear a brown suit east of Chicago. Because apparently people in New York only wear pinstripes or black or navy blue. And he told me, whatever you remember this, son, when you get older, don't stop moving. That's becoming really handy right now as I age. So I keep moving. But he was a good man. My mother was a tall, big-boned redhead, 6 feet tall, who was still angry with her father for making her stop playing softball. She made great fried chicken. If I get home in time today, as a matter of fact, I'm going to make a fried chicken using her recipe. And my daughter and her new boyfriend and my wife and I are going to Shakespeare Festival at CU. So I'll be using Mom's recipe to make fried chicken tonight. I had two sisters. June was a nurse. She loved nursing. She was one of the early nurse practitioners. She went into nursing education, but just didn't care for it. So she went back out and just started doing her person-to-person nursing again. She was one of the strongest people I've ever met in my life. Her fraternal sister, Jean, both of whom were 10 years older than me, was quite sick. She was born with some congenital heart issues. So she was quite sick, but she became a teacher. And she got married, had one child, and passed away in her late 30s. I'll never forget her laugh. She had the biggest laugh I've ever heard in my entire life. From time to time, my daughter laughs her laugh, and it warms my heart a little bit. But I had three mothers, and as a sickly child, that meant I really didn't have to do much of anything. So I never learned how to clean a house very well and how to do the dishes very well, but I do the best I can. And I am a very good cook. As a matter of fact, I could actually, call myself chef. I don't, but I could. I've had that amount of training. Never with the idea of, becoming a chef as an occupation, just because I loved it. I began cooking. Well, let me go back a little bit. When I came back, after a while, I moved to Colorado. I remember coming down 7 Arapahoe Boulevard because the turnpike was still there, the Boulder-Denver Turnpike, and it cost like $0.25. So, I came down the Highway 7 to save the toll of the Boulder-Denver Turnpike. And there's a hill there, and you get to the top of the hill, and you look all across the Boulder Valley to the Flatirons and to NCAR. And I said, yeah, this is home. And I went and stayed there. I got a job running the freshman chemistry labs at CU. I would, get everything together, the unknowns, the reagents, everything needed to be done, the information, and work with the TAs and so on. And it was a good job. It was a great job. I loved CU, loved Boulder. Became friends with a lot of different people. And one day, one of the grad students in the chemistry department and I were going out to a party up on the hill. We got there and we came in, and I looked across the room, and there was this short little girl with long, straight brown hair. She was wearing a leotard top and a jeans skirt. She had made herself, patches and all. And so I went over and talked to her, and she was funny and made me laugh. And we went home together that night. Sorry, it was the early 70s. That was kind of what you did. And I've been with her ever since, 50 years now. She was, at that time, a North Shore Chicago hippie. She later became an elementary educator. We owned an art gallery together in Boulder. She's an incredible ceramicist. She has a laboratory in her basement. She raised two of the most wonderful children that you'll ever encounter, and she's put up with me for 50 years. And
so Larry, with all your training, just to jump back a little bit to when you got back from Vietnam, from Japan, with all your training, it seemed like it was a natural progression for you to just become a chemist. So what happened?
Well, I was a chemist. It could have been a natural progression for me to become a laboratory technician again. And I did try that at a hospital here in Denver. But after my experience, as many will tell you, it just was too boring.
It was dull.
It was just dull. I just couldn't do it. And I wanted to, I've always felt I needed to be kind of my own supervisor, my own boss. I never liked the idea of somebody else doing it. So I wanted to keep that going on. I worked at the laboratory for many years, but then I started working, creating tests for this gentleman who did things using petroleum. And you need to be able to describe to the petroleum companies the qualities that he wanted. He was doing reservoir liners and things such as that. So I developed the tests, and they were all perfectly. Could we stop for a minute? Oh, yeah. All right, so what was I saying?
Well, we're not rolling right now, but I loved that you had told me that you had this plan, and then you got back here and working in the laboratory was dull. And that's
thank you. I figured I knew that immediately.
And that you actually missed the adrenaline of doing something.
Oh yeah, well,
because I love that where that landed you in disasters.
Yeah, it did. It did, didn't it?
So that's where I was. That's kind of what I was trying to prompt there.
Good. Thank you. Okay. Are we ready to go?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
My mom always said tall women should sit up straight.
So I worked at CU. I was quite happy with that job. But we got married and we began to have children. And I was working then for the gentleman who was in the petroleum industry, developing the tests that he needed to be able to know the quality of those tests. And he introduced me to an architect in Boulder who had the largest architectural engineering firm at the time. And I began to run his laboratory. It was a materials testing laboratory as opposed to exclusively chemistry, but it was something I could do because I know how to do that sort of stuff. And so I did that for a while until the principal of the company retired, and then I bought the laboratory. And Jan and I began to set off on a path of perhaps a chemical testing laboratory, an environmental laboratory, and we did it at a time when the government was coming out with all sorts of regulatory tests. One of them was the AHERA, the Asbestos Hazards Emergency Response Act, which said that every public building has to be inspected. Any asbestos that is found had to be examined, and a containment plan had to be developed, and training had to occur. And so that meant literally every school. So there are groups called BOCES, Boards of Cooperative Education. And so I began to go to the BOCES, and we got basically all of these schools in Colorado under contract to do that, all the schools in Colorado, to do that work. And as well as some in New Mexico, southern New Mexico. So then we, over the course of time, we broadened our work. We did underground storage tank inspections. We did lead paint. We did inspections for people who were preparing to buy a property. We were certified through the EPA to be able to, if we went out and inspected a property and did the histories on it, and then told somebody, no, there's no hazardous materials on this site. And if later they found out that there was, they would not charge the person who had bought the property to pay for them, to pay for the cleanup. So that was a very sellable service. We did this, and Jan started her gallery, and things were going along very nicely. My first son was born. I one time was watching a company put down concrete bike path over behind Mary Street Housing at CU, and if you can know where to look, you will find a thing that says DLS, and with his birth date, and it's still there. And that went on quite well, and we did fine, until one day in 1993, I was down in Denver in a building that had been abandoned and gutted out. They had been taking the asbestos off of the exhaust fumes at the very top of the building, and it was 40 feet down to the basement. And I was up on a catwalk. I needed to get onto the ladder to go up to attach the pump that would draw air in so we could see if there was asbestos in the air. And unfortunately, no one had secured the ladder. So I noticed that the catwalk was going by, and realized we're going to ride this ladder down to the ground. It was interesting because I didn't really regret actually dying, which I assumed was going to happen.
So I just want to clarify. So you were on the catwalk 40 feet up and you fell.
Oh, no, I stepped onto a ladder.
You stepped onto a ladder.
I'm going down, holding onto the ladder, assuming, so I assumed that probably I'm going to die. And that wasn't too bad, but what was bad was at this time, we were just a brief period of time away from my daughter's wedding. And I was really sad that I wasn't going to get to dance at my daughter's wedding. That's like, geez, that's not fair. So I decided, okay, I'm going to do a parachute roll. If you don't want to know what a parachute roll is, if you're parachuting, when you hit the ground, you don't want to have your legs stiff. You want it to be like a spring so that the impact will not be transmitted into your internal organs in your abdomen. So I hit ground, I rolled, I broke my hip, had an open break on my right leg, and I was in pretty bad shape, and I was laying there bleeding on the ground. And now I had a Motorola cell phone, one of the early cell phones, but it was out in my truck. And it's 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. No one's coming back till 7 in the morning. I'm lying on a concrete floor. I said, I'm not going to look at my leg because I didn't want to go into shock. So I pulled myself hand over foot to the stairs, up the stairs. I leaned on this iron door and put my body in between it and so it wouldn't close. And I yelled, help! And some angel came over and found me, went out and got my phone, and we called 911. And then I called Jan. So I was telling her, Jan, I fell. I'm not going to die, but I'm pretty badly injured. And just at that moment, the ambulance got there. The medics came in. And the next thing Jan heard this, and please forgive me, oh, shit! Because there was a blood line all the way down to the middle of the pool floor. So they took me to what was then Denver General Hospital, which was at the time probably the best trauma hospital in the area, and took care of me. Jan came. She recalls sitting there in the waiting room saying, well, I'm going to go see that guy who has 2 bags of broken bones for feet now, and so on and so forth. She called my rabbi, who came immediately, and between the two of them, they held my hand. And they kept having problems believing there was no internal injury because of the extent of my leg injuries, my feet injuries. So I kept having to go do CAT scans and so on. But eventually they got me to a room. It was in a room with a gentleman who had been in a fight with some drug dealers. He had abdominal shots, and Jan was a little concerned about that. So she had an ambulance come and take me to Boulder Community Hospital. And I was there for a while. Stayed with the gentleman, Mr. Milken, his name was, and he was in the bed next to me and was not doing well, but he kept saying, Larry, Larry. Well, I've learned how to be of service by this point, but there just wasn't much I could do for him at this time. So pretty soon, Mr. Milken got to go home. So I had a long period of rehabilitation at that point. We sold the laboratory. I was downstairs with a hospital bed, and then before long I got to go to physical therapy, to the warm pool over at Mapleton Rehabilitation Center, which is no longer there. And they told me, well, you're never going to walk unassisted alone. And there's a good possibility you're going to be in a wheelchair in about 10 years. So you need to start planning for that. Jan immediately began to look for ranch houses. And I immediately just said, no, I am going to walk unassisted. I was an athlete, and I was the type of athlete is when they told me to do 12 reps, I did 15. They told me to do 15, I did 18, because I figured that way I'd be doing more than anybody else. So when they told me to do 12 reps, I did 15. And I stayed late and worked on the bike, the stationary bike, and I went to the warm water, and I did all this stuff at home, and now I can walk unassisted, and it's many years later.
And I wouldn't have known you ever had that injury.
Well, if you saw the scar, you would. So Jan did, in fact, find a ranch house. we bought the house as really good friends of ours that we live in now. It's a beautiful ranch house, a big basement now full of her studio, right on the edge of an environmental easement. You can look across and see an old homesteader's house, and it turned out to be the perfect place for us to finish raising our children. We're still there. It wasn't much too big for us, but I'm going to have them bury me in the backyard along with a couple of dogs we have. And
so you had that incident, that accident,
right,
and kind of a forced retirement from the laboratory life. But you don't retire well.
No, I
So
don't
what did
retire
you
well.
do?
You're right, of course. Yeah, in addition, after we got the house, we got settled in back to normal. I started looking for something to do because I wasn't happy. And there was a large engineering firm out of Virginia called Parsons Brinkerhoff. They've been around since the 1800s. They were the ones who did the big dig in Boston. If you know that, didn't work out that well, but most of the stuff has worked out well. And they had a contract with FEMA to send out inspectors to be the first people the people in national disasters actually saw, to go ahead and evaluate the damage within the regulations and send back reports directly to FEMA. And so I could do that. So I did. I took the training. And the first place I was sent to was Cleveland, Ohio, after a flood. And I loved it. I loved sitting down with these people and hearing what they had to say, just listening, not giving them advice, just listening. I was good at doing the work. I could do it on my own. It was one of those other jobs, once again, where I really didn't have a boss. I just had people I had to report to. I had a lot of people who were quality control types and making certain the work that I was done was high enough quality. But I made my own hours. I made my own phone calls. I did the work on my own, and it worked out very well.
So to clarify, a disaster would happen.
Right.
And you would be one of the first people to show up.
Yeah, it would either be, Larry, they just had a hurricane down in New Orleans. We're going to meet at the New Orleans yada, yada, yada hotel tomorrow morning at 4. Here's the number for the travel people. And I would call up, and they'd have me on a plane in a couple hours.
And you'd meet with families that maybe lost their home.
Yeah, then they would go, the people who would apply to FEMA for assistance, their names would be given to us. And I would call them up and make an appointment and go out. I would assess the damage. As they always told us, you don't have to look at the videotape, you have to listen to their stories. So I would listen to the stories, I would send the reports in. I was good at it, so my reports were always quality work. And so before long, every disaster that happened, I got called to. So, I had to go back.
Stories is a theme that you've had throughout.
Well, I was beginning to realize that I really, as I said, at the hospital in Japan, we did the best we could. And I also began to realize if this is something you can do, you need to do it. And I also realized that, I'm never going to be Moses, but maybe I can make the world a little bit better than it would have been if I hadn't been here, And that was something I got, I think, from my father. I do remember when first time I told him that I was opening my own business, and he said, "Oh, that's good. And then you get to pick your own hours, and you can pick which 12 you care to work." And he was right, But he was very much about, he was a union guy, and he was a union guy for a reason. He's also the guy who taught me probably my ethical position, not my religious position, but my ethical position. He taught me you never decide about people based upon the color of their skin, based upon their size, based upon their sex, based upon their intelligence. You decide based upon the types of things that they say to you and the types of values they have, and I've always done that as well. But so I responded literally to every national disaster for 15 years until I got to be 70. And I'd come back from, I did the disaster, the flood in Boulder, 120 days in a row or something. I worked for that one. You'd work 12 to 14 hours a day, then you'd set up your next day. So it was hard work, but I was still able to do it. But one day I was out mowing the lawn after I'd come home from a deployment, and I realized that this is really hard. You're really tired. It's time to do something else. The recovery curve had become just too low and too slow. And so I decided that I would take care of that as well. So I stopped that job.
At 70.
Could we stop for a moment again? Yeah. All right. So where were we?
I think we're
I was talking about
finished,
retiring.
Yeah.
So, Yeah, it was just time for me to try retirement again at age 70. Try retirement again at age 70. And so I did. And things were quite fine. I was able to find stuff to do. But I got a call from a friend of mine who I'd known for years who was involved in hospice. And she said, "Larry, how come you're not volunteering for hospice?" So she was quite aware of my background and everything. And so I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she told me what you do. She, in fact, had your position, and she was your predecessor. So I applied, and True decided that I could take the training, which I did. And I began to work in the inpatient unit, first of all. This was during COVID. So there was very little I could do except answer the phones and sit in the IPU. But that was fine, got comfortable there. And eventually COVID went away. And then I could start doing some of the things to help the nurses. I could help move people and fill out forms and answer the phones. And at the end of people's lives, I could sit with them if there's no one else to sit with them. And then eventually we began to do some programming around our veterans because True and its sister hospices realized that we're working in an aging population and we have a lot of veterans in there and we need to do something for them. We need to let them know that we remember what they did. And so I began to work in some of the programs that we had. Excuse me. One of them.
For free. You worked for free.
I did work for free, and you point that out every time you can, don't you? If I don't do really well in giving one of my speeches, she will always say, "Don't worry, he works for free." So, I love that. If I start coughing. But we had programs where we worked primarily with veterans at the end of their lives. We would go for our Vietnam era veterans and present them with some beads that were made by other Vietnam veterans, and a little pin from True, and an American flag, and a star from a flag which had flown over the country. And then I would talk with them, and so if they were able to, they would respond. If they can't, I know they still heard me anyway, and I would tell them my story. And then I would stand up and I would salute them and I would say, "Welcome home. Welcome home." And people really loved that, and it breaks me up every time. So I've been doing that for a long time, and we've also since developed a lot of other programs. We do programming around Veterans Day. We do programming around Vietnam Veterans Welcome Home Day. And
I would love to hear, if you don't mind, because I know that you have been at the bedside of countless veterans who are facing end of life.
I am. Hold on. I have to stop for a minute. All right. So, one of the things that I've learned as a result of working for hospice is that it's really important to allow yourself to process and to feel the events that have shaped you. When I first came home, as I told you, I just pretty much got rid of everything that was a part of my military life. It just went away. And I didn't think about it. I didn't talk about it for many, many years. My wife was under the impression that I, in fact, had been a conscientious objector because I, at one point, mentioned that, I wanted to object conscientiously. And that's all she knew about it. But eventually my children, I think, began to ask questions, and I began to tell them bits and pieces of it. And they found it interesting, so I told them some more. And as a result of that, I began to really begin feeling the things that occurred back there. And it just reinforced to me even more the fact that I need to do something that involves being of service to somebody other than me, because I can get very uncomfortable in my own skin if I don't, And really all I want to do is be comfortable in my own skin, I've been blessed with an incredibly good life. And I don't want to miss it because I was too busy, worrying about things. I don't want to miss it because I was too busy feeling sorry for myself. So if I'm thinking about you, guess what? I'm not thinking about me. So, I've kind of used that as what I do when I work for you, It's, I'm thinking about them. I'm not thinking about me. And, there's I mean, there is an old Hasidic saying, you know, if God puts something bad in your life, the least you can do is be unhappy for a little while. So I'm not, yeah, I'm okay with being happy for a little while when something bad happens. When I work with some of the people we work with, they're at the end of their lives, and so inevitably, they're going to pass. Many of them are going to pass away, and it makes me sad. But you know, by the same token, I know we did the best we could. So I remember, gosh, so many of the men and women that I've worked for. I remember early on, there was a gentleman. I was going to his house, and I was going to do one of our pinnings. His family was going to be there. His social worker was going to be there. And he was an end-stage pancreatic cancer patient. When I got there, he was sitting next to his wife. He was wearing a hospital gown, very thin. And, you know, I explained to him what I was doing. We talked about some of our experiences, some stuff the family had never heard before. And we talked about coming home, which is something I always hit. And he agreed with me that it was difficult. And then I explained to him, you know, some years ago, Congress suggested that it was not only desirable, but perhaps mandatory for veterans to actually salute the flag as a symbol of as our national symbol when it's presented, rather than simply putting your hand across your heart. And I said, I've come to believe that you're just as much a symbol of this country as the flag is. So I'm going to salute you as I give you these beads. And I explained that the beads were made by Vietnam veterans to be given to Vietnam veterans. And he said, no, I'm going to stand up. And so his wife helped him up, and I stood in front of him, and I presented arms and ordered arms and said, welcome back. And I could see him take his breath, and his wife, he said, I want you to pin the beads on me, to his wife. So I took his arm and held his arm while his wife pinned the beads on his gown, you know. And then he sat down and just kind of went, a little smile, you know. And it warmed my heart. So the family loved it, as they frequently do. There have been many occasions like that. One time I ran into a gentleman my age over at a coffee shop, and he had on a t-shirt that said Vietnam. And I said, hey, are you Vietnam? He said, yeah. He said, when? And he told me the years. I said, yeah, I was there too. And what were you? He said, I was a medic. I said, oh, okay. Yeah, you guys are heroes. And he said, I don't know. So then he sat down, and he talked to me, and it was real clear he was struggling. You know, life was not being easy. He was having physical problems that he wasn't dealing with, you know, problems with family and so on and so forth. And I said, you know, tell me some stories. And he did. And I'm not going to repeat them, you know, because many of them involved people stepping on bombs that were meant to destroy tanks rather than individuals, and what happens when things don't go right in the jungle. But I explained to him, you know, if you share these stories, these memories, that you don't relive them, because people who have PTSD tend to actually be reliving those memories, not just remembering them. I said, but when you share them, so they just become stories then. We all have stories. Some stories are nice, some stories are ugly, but they're just stories. And I have no idea what happened to him. I know when I walked away, the last thing he said to me, Larry, there just was so much blood. And I said, yes, I know. Which reminded me of sitting on the helicopters looking over at another trooper over there holding onto a hose with a compressor, and realizing that his job was to clean the blood out of the chopper if necessary. So, you know, it was the guys who did that work, and the gentlemen who we work with are all heroes, and every single one of them. But the people in the medical corps, including the chopper pilots and the medics and the field, are perhaps even more heroic. I don't know. Chopper pilots went in to LZs that were hot again and again and again, frequently against the order of their superiors. You know, medics, actually, many of them would take their rather meager wages and have their families send back medical supplies because they wanted to be able to have more that they could do for these men and women when they were injured. It was quite amazing and quite interesting and quite exhilarating to see these people and to know them.
So for 5 years, you've been volunteering
Mm-hmm.
for hospice.
Yes.
Listening to people's stories about their service. How has that listening impacted
Mm-hmm.
your own experience with your service?
Well, it's thank you, Becky. It's allowed me to do that same thing. It's allowed me to come here and tell you my story now. Something which I wouldn't have been interested in doing. I wouldn't have thought you would have been interested in hearing. It's allowed me to come to realize that, at one time there was a path that was set down for me, and it would have been a good path. It would have been fine, but it wasn't the path that I needed to walk. When I look at my life now, I realize those experiences that I had in Japan made me, to some degree, who I am. I know that the experience that I've had in raising 2 children and going to natural disasters. I remember it was in North Carolina. I got an appointment, and I went to a gentleman's house. Nobody was there except this one rather sickly-looking guy. And so we sat down and talked, and after I did the inspection, and he told me, I've only got a few weeks to live. And so I ended up sitting there with him for about 3 hours talking, and nobody ever came back. But that kind of came back into my memory when I started thinking about doing this, because I said, well, I can do that, So, it opened up the experiences I had in Japan and made them more potent. It opened me up and made me able to do more things. It made me be able to accept that I'm who I am, I used to want to be, I used to be really good at being who I thought you wanted me to be. I made a living doing that when we ran the environmental consulting firm. I was very good at telling you, I'm going to give you exactly what you need, and when you get it, I'm going to tell you exactly how to use it, and you're going to be the one who gets all the credit. And it worked very well, thank you, but it wasn't particularly enriching to me, except in terms of dollars. So, I needed to have some experiences that allow me to think about the things that happened to me and process them and appreciate them and let them be what they are, which is memories, and to help other people do that. Now, we have a program now called squad meetings that we do in many of our units. We work, with our hospice beds and various long-term care units.
You're being modest. You developed the program that we're doing called Squad Meetings.
Well, thank you.
And why did you come up with the name Squad Meetings?
Well, squad meetings were something that occurs frequently. It's a smaller group of people, maybe 12 soldiers, and their superior, their NCO, or their second lieutenant get together and make plans for what's going to be coming in the future. Here's what's coming. What are you going to do about it? Here's what we're going to do. Tonight we're going to go out and take a nice little hike into the jungle. And we're going to find a place, and we're going to sit down, and we're going to wait for somebody to come by, and then we're going to kill them. And then we're going to count how many bodies there are and come back and tell me. But we don't do that. But we do give people a chance to eat some pizza and have a chocolate chip cookie. And I get to tell them some of my stories, and they get to tell me some of theirs. The last one we had involved a lot of crying. Some guys were looking at some stuff that was hard to look at, and they were in front of us, were able to do it, and it blows my mind. So I think this program is working very effectively. If I were going to design another program for you, I think it would be teaching civilians how to talk to veterans. Yeah, I really appreciate when someone tells me, thank you for your service. I do. But I sometimes, just because I'm ornery, say, that's what I said to my waiter last night. He still wanted a tip. And people don't always appreciate that. What can you do? So, yeah, it's opened me up. It's made me more open. It's made me a better person. You've given me so much more than I've given you, that I can't even begin to tell you. I love doing this work. I love being with veterans. There's a program that is called Medical Assistance with Dying. Is that right?
MAID, Medical Aid in
Medical Aid in Dying. MAID, M-A-I-D. We got a call from a gentleman. He wanted a veteran, to come out and talk to him because he had a date certain when his life was going to end. So I came out. God, we talked for hours the first day. He told me, one story he told me was when he went for R&R in Japan. He was on his 3rd tour in Vietnam. He had been one of these gentlemen, I might talk about another gentleman like that, who had been given the option of going to jail or to the Army, and he chose the Army, and he loved it. But he was on R&R. He was in Tokyo. He was at Tachikawa Air Force Base. And they said, hey, do you want to ride into Tokyo? He said, no, I want a case full of ice and beer. I want a TV set, and I want a chair with a back on it, because he'd been so tired of sitting on cots out in the boonies. So he did it. He says, the best R&R I ever had in my life. And he told me other stories in front of his daughter that he had never shared with anybody else. We stayed together for about 4 hours that day, and I asked him if I could make him a meal. Something he'd really like to eat before, and he said, no, I've got some friends doing that. I said, if you want to, I can come and stand in the door after you get your medication. I'll be here and stand in the door. He said, no, but I want you to come one more time next week. And so he did. Yeah. In Vietnam, another set of heroes were the non-commissioned officers who were there for their second and third trips, because they knew what was happening. And they understood that right now, their purpose was to get as many of these young men home as they possibly could in one piece. And they knew how to do it. And it didn't involve putting them in harm's way. It involved keeping them out of harm's way. So I've been eternally grateful that, despite the fact that we lost so many and so many were damaged and wounded, so many were saved by people such as, NCOs. There was a guy called Sergeant Major Banta, who I met one day. He was maybe the most intelligent, most articulate man I've ever met in my entire life. And he gave me a lot of advice that I still, to this day, continue to use. So, it's the wisdom that you find out there that makes you change and become more important, more a part of yourself, to be able to process the things in your life more easily. And, if you look, it's everywhere. It's in people, particularly people at the end of their life sometimes become very, very focused, very, very aware of what's important, Could
you tell me about the gentleman that you supported in Denver?
Which one?
The one you were just touching on about, I didn't want to use his name, but
no.
About that was unhoused.
That's what? Sorry?
That was unhoused.
Oh, my goodness, yes. That's interesting. Yeah, we had Becky and I were actually on a panel one time that was on the internet, and Becky got a call not too long after that, from a gentleman who ran a hospice here in Denver. And it was a hospice for the unhoused. And they were running low in funding. And so they wanted us to come and do one of our pinnings there, and they would invite all the volunteers and the staff and other people.
A veteran on their service,
yeah. And so we agreed to do that. And we went down and met a young, no, he wasn't young, he was a man named Daniel. Daniel.
Don't say his last name.
Oh, I won't say his last name. I'm not sure I remember his last name. But, good old Hippo. Daniel had also been given a choice of going to jail or going to the Army. He went to the Marines instead. He would maintain that the reason the judge did that was because he was dating the judge's daughter. Perhaps that's true. I'm not certain. But he did. He went to the Marines. It was near the end of the Vietnam conflict. It wasn't a war, They never declared war. And he was in Da Nang. Da Nang is near North Vietnam. Da Nang is near Hue, the most beautiful city in Vietnam. Da Nang is one of the few places where the Marines had actually ever been driven out of one of their camps. And the North Vietnamese drove the Marines out. And then after that, there was street fighting in Hue, which caused an incredible amount of damage. But at this time, the Marines were back in Da Nang, and they were bugging out. So they were taking the huge transport planes and putting all the heavy equipment. Most of the staff and had already left, and Daniel was there with a few men, but getting everything that we were going to take with us onto planes, getting ready to leave. And eventually they got done. They flipped out the lights. They got on the planes and flew away. Daniel came home, got discharged, sent out on his own. Shortly thereafter, his entire family was killed in a car wreck. Daniel became unhoused, began to use drugs. I'm sure he had PTSD. I'm not a practitioner. I can't make a diagnosis, but I'd bet you he did. And when we met him, they brought him out onto the stage where I was in a wheelchair. He looked slumped over. He looked this guy is definitely EOL. But we did the service, and I've been over and talked to him, as I like to do, so they can hear me. And we gave him his pen, and we gave him the star from an American flag. And I stood up in attention and saluted him. And then I said, I'll come see you next week. I didn't think he would be here next week, but I did. And I came back, and Daniel was standing up in the room next to where the beds were, trying to convince one of the volunteers to take him outside to smoke a cigarette, and he was better. And he had told the head of the hospice, I want you to take that star, and when I die, I want you to put it in my shirt, because I'm taking it with me, So Daniel and I got to spend a few weeks together. Eventually, he had to leave that facility, and I was able to help him find out where the money the VA was giving him was, because he didn't know. It was building up in a bank account. We found it for him. And then we found another place for him to go to be at the end of life. And we got to go.
Buried in a military
He was buried in a military cemetery at Fort Logan here. And I couldn't go to his funeral, but I sent him a nice, letter to him. And what it taught me was that, it doesn't matter what place people are who come to us. The impact of someone caring about them, someone giving them a warm bed, someone making certain that they have meals and the relief from pain that they need makes a huge difference. Daniel was so close to death, and he ended up having another, 3 or 4 months of life that was much better than the life he had had before. It just, once again, informed me of, the work we do is important work.
Well, and as a bystander, my observation was you showed up and gave Daniel an ear, and you listened to his stories, and he wasn't a person that had visited his own military experience in a long, long time. And at end of life became proud of it, so proud of it he asked to make sure he was buried with the star you gave him. And what you've done time and time again, and I can feel myself getting emotional.
Oh, me too.
Is you've created that space for people. I remember the World War II veteran who you were trying to pin, and he said, wait, did they forgive me? And you said, yeah, they forgave you. And he said, okay then, and lets you give him the certificate and the pins. I've remember countless people whose bodies maybe weren't working the same way that they used to when they were young, but when you gave them a salute, would do whatever they could to try to salute you back, even if they were bent over in a wheelchair. And you have been the catalyst for giving people dignity and an ear for their story and laughing with them about things that only another veteran can understand when you talk about boot camp and training and time in country and as a medic. And I just appreciate so much the way you have been generous with your story so that other people could have their story held.
Well, that's very kind of you, and thank you for saying that. I was told, another thing my father told me is, when someone gives you a compliment, you don't say, no, that's not true. That's really insulting when you do that, so thank you.
Especially when they're right.
But you also told me you were always right. So, so this work has helped me grow even in my advanced years, I think it keeps me younger. I think it gives me energy. It gives me a reason to get up in the morning. I get as much from it or more than anybody I've ever worked with. Some of the people I've met are phenomenal. We have a program in which we set up a relationship with a veteran. A couple of times a month, we go over and sit down with them for a couple of hours. It's a companionship program, vet to vet. And the first one I did was a gentleman who had been in Korea. He had been a guy who always wanted to be in the military. He wanted to be in the military. He asked his parents if he could join. He was 16. They wouldn't let him. When the Korean War started, he was 17. They allowed him to enlist, and he did. He told me the story about the time they were in formation, getting ready to be sent to Incheon, and they were out in the airway, and they saw a plane coming and landing and taxiing over next to them. They pushed the steps up to the plane, opened the door. Someone got out and walked over to a microphone and said, "Soldiers, my name is Dwight David Eisenhower, and I just came here to say goodbye to you and to tell you good luck and to tell you that things are going to be much better than they were for my boys." And he pointed up the sky. Another plane was going by. Parachute came out and something was floating down to the airport. Parachute broke, all of a sudden crashed to the ground. Well, excuse me, before that I said, "That's the new transport that you guys will be riding in. You won't be slogging through the mud." It fell to the ground and was totally destroyed. And one of his friends, who was the comic in the group, there's always one, this guy's a short guy from Brooklyn, said, "Hey, General, is it okay if we walk?" Broke everybody up. And he went on to be very successful working in the medical equipment business. He came up with a couple of really useful devices. He got funding for the people doing the research into heart transplants and kidney dialysis. He was madly in love with his wife, just as I've been madly in love with my wife. He talked about how much he looked forward to seeing her. His daughter was just wonderful, and he passed. And of course, I sat at his mass, funeral mass, and I still think about him. I still think about him. What a great guy he was. I have a story that I tell these guys sometimes. It's anecdotal, and in fact, it's not true, but I tell it anyway because it's fun. It seems that Hemingway was at his favorite bar in Venice, and the bartender, or the drunk next to him, said, "I'll bet you can't, bet you $500 you can't tell a story in 4 words." So he thought about it for a minute. He said, "Bring me to the Scotch." Thought about it for a few more minutes. He said, "For sale, baby shoes, never used." And the guy said, "Here's $500. And so, they loved that. They spent time on the internet looking to see if it was real or not. Next couple of weeks when I came, they said, "That was such a great story." "Not true, though, is it?" I said, "No, it's not."
Well, Larry, they are running out of time because we're going to use this room.
Okay.
And I know it was important to you to share that closing statement. So I was trying to pull it up on my phone so you could share it.
Okay.
But I don't know why it's not working. Can you read it that small?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I think in the Vietnam era, not all uniforms were worn in the jungle. Some were white lab coats, stained not with mud, but with solutions and samples that helped save countless lives. The 406 Medical Laboratory in Japan played a vital role in keeping soldiers safe, quietly, carefully, and with extraordinary dedication. Thank you, Beck, for helping us remember.
You don't have to thank me at the end, but I know that you wanted to read that.
Is that good?
I think so. Or do you want him to read it again without me interrupting him, if you want to use it?
Oh, it's fine. You did a good job.
Pardon me?
No, it was great.
Are you fine? Are we good? Okay.
All right. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Maybe one final, any last question?
Question about you being a conscientious objector.
Mm-hmm.
Were you carrying a weapon?
Well, see, I didn't take that status because. Yeah, I had I taken the status. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't take the status because the concern was that I would just be a good old field medic, which is a very dangerous situation, and there were people who didn't want me to put myself in that situation, and the option that I took gave me the opportunity to do some of the same sorts of work. I had a sidearm, but I never fired in anger at anybody, and it just was the decision that I had to make conscientiously, and it came out with a different end than I would if I had said, "I object conscientiously to war," and refused to fire at someone.
Do you have any last things you would like to say to peers, Vietnam-era veterans?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would. Let me think about that for just a second. They never declared, there is no such thing as the Vietnam War. The Congress never declared war. The war, we put our soldiers into Vietnam on the basis of the Tonkin Resolution, which may or may not actually involve an actual incident. But they sent us there with conventional weapons to fight a guerrilla war against a guerrilla group who had just finished booting the French out, and prior to that, the Japanese, and several times the Chinese prior to that. And we learned how to survive in those conditions. All of the mighty military of the United States Army didn't help. Some of it was really useful, the artillery. You know, for instance, there was a thing called Puff the Magic Dragon, which was a gunship that had machine guns on one side, and we could take that and just go in concentric circles around and around and around, essentially kill everything that happened to be in that area. But we went there, despite the fact that we were in an area in which we were working in a war which didn't have any glory. We had the same feelings, the same fears, the same exhilaration that all of the soldiers that had gone to war before us. You know, the thing about war is it's either incredibly boring or it's madly crazy. And we were able to deal with both those situations. Some of us looked for aids in the form of drugs, in the form of alcohol, but most of us looked for the aid where it was most available, which is from that person standing in front of you or to your left or right in the formation. And we carried each other. We made it so that as many of us as possible could get home. The problem that we've had is that when we got home, we forgot some of that stuff, but we're remembering it now. You know, we have a series of people who understand that there is a Vietnam era veterans, both in country and out of country. And we all served our country, and we all were moved, scarred, given growth by it. So, you know, I'm both grateful that I was able to have that experience and grateful that I have this cohort of colleagues, veterans, men and women, nurses and infantrymen and mechanics who I can walk up to and talk to like that, who I can identify with as deeply as possible. And believe me, for many, many years, I was not the guy that you want to go to if you wanted to have an intimate relationship. You know, I was the guy who kept himself to himself. Not that anymore. I feel like I'm giving myself to other people, and I get back way more than I give. So.
Well, Larry, thank you for your service
well,
and welcome home.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh,
No. What are we doing?
can I shake your hand? I hug this guy.
You do. Absolutely. Thank you. All right.